And likewise, I've been to Central Sterile Processing many times. I bring donuts. So we have a session where why do we need 4 different kerosins for a laminectomy? 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter, 4 millimeter. Why, they're all kerosins, they all bite bone, but why do we need them? And, and so that people can understand we need them because at certain parts of exposing a nerve root, we are in smaller places, and that's why we need these.
From the basement to the boardroom, from ideas to innovation, you're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are pushing the sterile processing industry forward. Each week, you'll encounter diverse perspectives from subject matter experts across the country and around the globe. Frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
On this episode of Beyond Clean, we are going to be speaking with Dr. George Cybulski, Associate Professor of Surgery at St. George's University. And this whole season, we're going to be talking to surgeons, lots of great conversations. Today, we're going to talk about surgeons and how they learn. And Dr. George, obviously as an Associate Professor, Hank, is going to give us a lot of insight into the curriculum and specifically around instrumentation. What do surgeons learn about instruments when they are residents and just becoming familiar with what their practice is going to be the rest of their lives?
Yeah, Justin, we focus a lot on this channel about educating sterile processing, and this is going to be a great opportunity to see it from the other side of the surgical table and, hopefully highlight some opportunities for sterile processing leaders out there to better collaborate and interface with their new surgeons, whether they're coming out of school or just new to your facility, for how to make sure that they're most comfortable and familiar with your inventory to better serve your patient population.
All right, we're going to be right back. Stay with us. Dr. George Cybulski up next. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Dr. George Cybulski, Associate Professor of Surgery at St. George's University. And Dr. George, it's great to have you back. And honestly, you're the only surgeon I think that we've talked to that has been certified in sterile processing. So not only are you a great fit for the theme of this season, but you're just a great fit for our audience. And so I just wanted to welcome you back. We're going to have a really engaging discussion about teaching today.
It's my pleasure to be back with Beyond Clean. You guys do an awesome job of getting the word out and helping to fulfill the critical mission of making sure that our ability to operate is at the top of the scale.
Excellent. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about your background as well? I know that we interviewed you before, and we definitely had you talk, about yourself, but maybe even tell us briefly about your background and then what you've been doing since the last time we talked to you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, as you know, I've been a neurosurgeon in the past. I'm a recovering neurosurgeon, if you will, having obtained a certification in sterile processing, because basically as a neurosurgeon, after the first few thousand operations, I started to kind of look at behind the process of the instruments, looking at how they fit into basically what my theme is for all of us that are involved in the operating room. And that is the optimal experience of flow, creating flow. And so in my own mind, I had my thoughts about instruments and how they got there, but I wanted to dive into that, and I've done that, and it's been fascinating and rewarding.
So, Dr. George, obviously the topic of today's interview is teaching the future surgeon. In this entire season, we're talking to surgeons and we're talking about the intersection of instrumentation. And I was really excited about this interview in particular because obviously, surgeons are made. They're not necessarily born. So there's some kind of introduction to the culture of surgery broadly, and obviously a lot of scientific training, medical training, but it eventually gets to the instrument because that's the interface between the surgeon and the patient, is that magical intersection of the instrumentation. That's where sterile processing comes right into the picture too. So I want to get into that entire kind of flow, from brand new surgeon right out of school into the instrumentation and into the actual procedures. But before we get there, I know you gave a little bit of background just broadly about yourself, but how did you get into teaching and what drew you that direction, right? Because not every surgeon is also a professor. So walk us through that.
Well, thank you. I mean, basically the whole process that gets any of us who work in the operating room started is an interest in learning. And for me, fortunately, I don't know, I've had a number of great mentors who have impressed upon me. And these are people that were still working into their 80s, not as neurosurgeons, but as pathologists, neuropathologists. And what impressed me about that is the constant focus on learning. That's where it all starts. With the whole team, everyone that I've encountered, with very, very rare exception, just hundreds of people that I've worked with in the operating room, are interested in learning. And if you are interested in teaching, that is sharing with them, what you are doing with the instruments in particular, they're very, very open to that. And it just creates this connection, making it truly a team effort.
Well, speaking of learning, before we get too deep into this interview and before I make a fool of myself, I should know this by now, but can you outline that process and category of like a student, a resident, I know there's probably a couple of different other classifications. That way I can ask more intelligent questions as we move forward here.
Well, you're doing great. But, in the operating room, we have the, categories of people involved as part of the team. So there are nursing students and nurses. There are medical students and residents who in particular are going into surgery or neurosurgery. And then there are the operating room techs who have gotten training in handling the instruments and or are scrubbing in as new techs to learn the instruments and learn the flow of the operation and utilizing the instruments. And then there are the certified sterile processing technicians who really, for me, I was fortunate enough to be able to connect with the sterile processing techs and really have an interchange of knowledge, them showing me what they did to get the instruments ready and my showing them on various spine models or skull models what these instruments were necessary for.
Yeah, we've done a couple of episodes and interviews in the past talking about what makes a high-performing sterile processing technician. So I want to turn that question around to you on the surgical side and just say, you've trained a lot of young surgeons in your career. What traits or attributes have stuck out to you as kind of marking those potential ones where you're like, hey, like the old cliche, what do you call the doctor that graduated last in the class? Doctor, right? But there's still a spectrum in that ability as you move up to just really that excellent surgeon. So what are those things that you would classify and say, yeah, these are the marks that there's a lot of potential in that person to do great things?
Well, top of the list, we've already mentioned just this continuous commitment to learning. And going along with that is a commitment to being open with people, recognizing and admitting to oneself that no one knows everything. I've done thousands of operations, we'll say, on a lumbar herniated disc, and they're all different. So once you kind of say, I've learned it and I know this, you kind of put up a barrier. So with students and residents, it's tough for them. They're under a lot of stress. And really to create as a leader, to create an atmosphere where people they're comfortable with asking questions. And so I think those are, so communication that's flows back and forth between all the members of the team and the interest in learning.
I'm really surprised. So skill, like natural skill and dexterity was not at the top of your list. Like, why not?
Because that's a great question. And in contrary, there's some books out there where you've got to do 10,000 of, this particular, you got to hit a golf ball 10,000 times in order to be like Tiger Woods and et cetera, et cetera. That's not really how it works. It's really everyone comes at it with a different ability to acquire skills. And really it's this openness to the information that's imparted. Myself as a mentor to young surgeons, medical students, operating room techs, is to be able to communicate to them, how we use this instrument, how we make a decision based on really the utilization, which I think is the most important part of being an excellent surgeon.
And that's a great throwback actually to episode 1 in this season. And we talked to Dr. Brian Segray, and, he comes from an artistic background. And so we talked about kind of the balance between the art and science of surgery. And you're kind of speaking to some of that right now, that it's not just a checklist in the book. And then you go in and you just check off the list in a surgery. There's some critical thinking that comes in, which is Justin's favorite theme, when we talk about sterile processing, because the same is true for us. You have to be able to pull all the wisdom out and then apply it to the specific situation that you're encountering. So I think that's a great call out. On the flip side, like you kind of spoke to the marks that kind of set out that successful surgeon. What are the things that you've seen on the teaching side of things that, maybe are some traits that you're seeing in the younger generation of surgeons coming through, or, students coming through? You're like, let's redirect that, or let's kind of prune that off to make sure that you're still going in the direction that you should be.
Well, that's a great question. And the fundamental kind of thing to overcome, if you will, is insecurity really results in shutting off the ability to acquire knowledge. And so, anyone who was put into the operating room, which is one of the most stressful situations in life, to really not let your defensiveness close you off from, being a good human being, having, the ability to communicate and in a respectful way, and to recognize there are other people in the operating room who are stressed as well. So I really think it's, we talk about human factors in sterile processing, repetitive motion and things like that. That's all important, for avoiding, injuries, repetitive stress injuries, carpal tunnel syndrome, shoulder injuries. But really it's the stress of the deadlines to meet that we really should be more aware of in terms of making our teammates' lives better.
You kind of started talking about instrumentation, and I know we were kind of finishing that line of thought there, but I want to go back to the instruments and sort of that training piece, because you alluded to an area of focus when it comes to instrumentation, and it's the tools, right? They're in your hands every single day, that stressful environment. And I really wonder how broad the training is, for new surgeons and for residents around instrumentation. I used to work for a repair company, and there were a couple of instances where I was asked to come in and present on inspection for new residents, because I know the repair budget always climbed through the roof when new residents sort of, came in, usually the August timeframe, I think it was. And so they just, really thought that would be a good value add to just create some awareness to that. But I don't know that was a standard, in surgical training programs. What do you think is a standard? What types of training do surgeons and residents get? And even ongoing, I think, would be applicable here too. But maybe starting with those first interactions with instrumentation as they're becoming acclimated.
Well, I think it's actually going to central sterile processing and seeing the trays, seeing the instruments in the trays, when they haven't been sterilized yet. I think what you said would be an ideal thing to do with every training program, with every start of the year or every biennial thing to do with changeover. Unfortunately, I don't think that gets enough emphasis. And so therefore, learning about instruments is basically catch as catch can still, and really trying to catch the name. And as we all know, because this has been our work, there are a lot of different names for instruments. You may go from Hospital A, where it's called a thingamajig, to Hospital B, where it's called Dr. Smith's thingamajig. And there's so much that goes into instruments. And I think really, if I was in control of an operating room, I would set it up so that everybody at the start of whatever the new period we'd have a conference together where we'd handle the instruments, we'd see them set up. I think that's a brilliant idea to have in effect.
Yeah. There's the naming piece, and I really want to sit on that for a second here. And I think the inspection piece is really important too, but I can see where the inspection really starts in sterile processing. There's a checks and balances for the surgical tech, when they're setting up the case and they're looking at the instruments and handing them to the surgeon. I feel like that awareness around inspection really needs to be there everywhere else. But the naming convention aspect that you're bringing up is really a huge thing in terms of adoption of technology today. It's really causing a lot of issues. The naming conventions aren't standard. People talk a lot about getting the count sheets right, and naming conventions are an issue and an obstacle for that. People want to do tray optimization projects, and I'd say a big part of the tray optimization projects end up becoming, how do we figure out what these instruments really are and what are the similarities from one tray to another? And there's a lot of pressure to be efficient. And I got to tell you, as I educated the OR and SPD, on instrumentation, over the years, and it's been a while since I did it, I always got the sense that the issues with the naming conventions kind of lied a lot more in the OR. I mean, I know a lot of SPD professionals spend a lot of time learning it. There's certification specific to instrumentation and getting the names right. Resources that I had at my disposal were like flashcards, like all of this information. And, I noticed that the surgical techs get a good amount, but it was really the nurses that I didn't think really ever had that access to that information. So I kind of, being a nurse and having gone through that training, I felt like I was making an informed blanket statement that a lot of the issues around naming convention had to do with the fact that we didn't really train the nurses. How blind was I to this idea that the surgeons wouldn't necessarily get the naming conventions either? And I think you kind of opened my eyes right there.
Yeah, I mean, on a lumbar laminectomy, there is a retractor that here in Chicago at Northwestern, where I worked for many years, was named after a by reputation, a very nice neurosurgeon there, Dr. Oberhill. But now I do some work at a small safety net hospital, same retractor, same type of case. And I just finally said, we're just going to call this the Oberhill retractor. It's not an Adson Beckman as I understand it. It's not a Wheatlander. We say that here in Chicago, in Germany, it's a Weitlander, but yeah, it's a big deal. And that interrupts the flow for sure of an operation when, people think it's, they worked or they've been trained a certain way.
I kind of now want to talk about your approach, right? So we kind of know what the state of the industry is in terms of this training. And a lot of the nurses training even is just on the job. And it sounds like that's very much the same for the surgeon. It's not that there isn't formal training, but I think it probably has a lot more to do with the biology and the science behind what's happening in surgery and not so much focused on instrumentation. And so as we talk about that and your experience having been in sterile processing and having gotten certified and knowing the importance of that, and even to the point of the naming, how do you approach, training residents in regards to like some of the things that come up with instruments? Like forget just the naming stuff and the exposure. Like what about when an instrument isn't functioning properly, or do they get exposure to if an instrument might actually be contaminated, or how to deal with substitutes? Like, hey, sometimes, especially in today's world with the supply chain disruption, you're not going to see the same instrument, or it's not going to be there. And, that's like one of those surprise situations, and nobody likes surprises in the middle of a surgery. How do you train for that?
That's a great question. And basically it is taking anyone who is part of the team and, having now it's formalized in terms of a timeout and et cetera. But I've always, it's kind of like being an airline pilot. I've always, with, the team talked about what we were going to do in terms of utilization of the instruments in order to do whatever the procedure was, So we do that before we, while the patient is going to sleep, or maybe even a little bit before that. And then once things start, that's part of what you have to expect in the operating room. And that is that there can be a component that is not what you're used to, may be broken, may have a piece of bone in it, may be missing. And you have to just not be in your head that, I can't go on without, that instrument. And that is very tough, though, to be able to do. And I think it really takes, what we're talking about now, and that is having a discussion with your team before you even get up there. And likewise, I've been to Central Sterile Processing many times. I bring donuts, so we have a session where why do we need 4 different keratins for a laminectomy? 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter, 4 millimeter. Why, they're all keratins, they all bite bone, but why do we need them? And so that people can understand we need them because at certain parts of exposing a nerve root, we are in smaller places, and that's why we need these. So, but you have to adjust though. I mean, if there is a piece of bone that through whoever's inability to see it previously is in your 2 millimeter keratin, well, you got to use your 3 millimeter keratin. It's up to, you don't stop an operation like you don't stop an air flight because the headwind is picked up, over Iowa heading to California. You don't stop, you've got to adjust. But I do that with the residents. I lecture them, if you will, in the guise of this is, mentorship and trying to make your life better and those who help you make their lives better. But it's really a philosophy of surgery that must be included as well.
It was so interesting hearing you talk through that, not getting in your head that you can't continue with the surgery if you're missing that instrument, because I've lived it from the other side, down in sterile processing, room 12 is calling and they need that one thing that is not in the doctor's tray. And we're like, the weight of the world is on our shoulders, like not as much as the surgeons because the patient's right there in front of them, right? So like when the nurse is calling frantic, like it just all comes down to us and we're like, oh no, like I don't know what's going on in that room. I don't know what they can do. I don't know what they can't do. I don't even know like what they could substitute. And it goes back to the training piece, for sterile processing is that critical importance of being broader in our understanding of the procedures themselves and just what's on the preference card. And I'll say like some of the most impressive technicians that I've encountered are the ones that's like, oh yeah, they don't have that in the tray. Well, Dr. Johnson has used this in the past when that happens. And man, like that is like, savior moments right there of, okay, you applied the wisdom, you got that critical thinking. It's not on anyone's preference card. It's not written down anywhere, but you just happen to know because you've been soaking up all these experiences again and again. It's just really magical and goes back to the collaboration piece, which I kind of want to move us, toward the close here of practical things, for folks tuning in. We're going to have a big sterile processing audience tuning in, probably some surgical techs, definitely some OR nurses, maybe even some fellow surgeons. What are those one or two things that you would want folks to leave in that collaboration mindset in this interview, thinking about how surgeons are trained, what the intersection is between reprocessing and using surgical instruments like we've been talking about, or even how teams can better communicate. As you started with at the beginning, like that's one of the attributes of a great surgeon. Like how can we better communicate as a care team to prep for, to overcome the kinds of challenges that we've been talking about?
Well, I think it's really for both sides of the Mayo stand to move toward that Mayo stand. And, you guys know what I mean, but what I mean is that we need to meet at that point. That's the intersection. We need to understand what is going on, why we need certain instruments, what are alternatives, as you just mentioned. I think that's fantastic. What are alternatives to those instruments if for whatever reason, the surgeon drops that 2 millimeter kerosene on the floor? That's his bad or her bad, So it happens, and really to induce panic, and I only say it because we're talking now, but we've seen it. To induce panic is just not a good look. It distracts your focus from solving the problem. And so I think what you guys do is fantastic. I'm so happy to be a part of it. And I continue to consult on sterile processing from the surgeon's perspective. I enjoy the interaction, just knowing more people on the team.
Dr. George, what I really love about this season, and it's not like we haven't had themes that are addressing a similar issue, but it's just the silos that we all operate in, especially, with the way that we view our day to day and with all the strain on healthcare right now, it's even easier to do it. It's how do I just get home alive? It's sometimes how people feel. And I think it's really great that, not only are you sort of bringing awareness to surgeons in the surgeon community around sterile processing, but also bringing that surgeon perspective, as you do these consulting engagements so that if we're going to try to transform healthcare, it not limited to sterile processing, but if we're going to transform healthcare, we need a lot of those overlapping perspectives to just help guide. And I'm actually talking also very much on the manufacturer side of the house. I'm sure you do lots of consulting organizationally with healthcare organizations, but I mean, even on the manufacturer side, like how do we find solutions that come into the hospital that are tailored to be able to set SPD up for success and still at the same time be something functional and usable in the operating room and ultimately in the hands of the surgeon. And so, just want to commend you on that work of just expanding your vision, keeping that nice and broad, and then bringing that back, not just siloing it to your own benefit, but to break out of that and share it with others. I just think is great, and really enjoyed this interview.
Well, thank you. Likewise, I think that what you're doing is great, and I'd love to talk either further off record about manufacturers and some interactions I've had with them. They're very interested in what we have to offer, for sure.
Oh, that's great. That's really good to hear. That, I realize we're not going to get into the specifics here, but I think that's something that's great for the Beyond Clean audience to hear, that there's a movement in that direction that way. So that's a very encouraging sign. All right, Dr. George, thanks so much for coming on the show. Great job again.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure, guys. Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. George Cybulski, Associate Professor of Surgery at St. George's University. Hank, it's really kind of funny sometimes, like the central connecting theme for just about everybody involved in surgery is instruments. And the central connecting theme about instruments is that there's no really formal education or training on the instruments themselves, how they function. And a lot of it, even in sterile processing, has really been in the past brought by either a certification or, the vendors themselves that relate to instruments. And it's not a surprise to me that we don't see a lot of official training for surgeons. But honestly, if we're all going to start talking the same language, instrumentation is the place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little surprised that there's not more training, right? Because they're not doing anything without tools in their hands, even if it's robotic tools these days. To not have a thorough, deep and broad understanding of the instruments and the functionality. I mean, obviously they grow to learn the instruments over time, like any good craftsman would. But yeah, it's encouraging and discouraging to know that sterile processing isn't the only part of surgery that struggles on standardizing education and getting into the weeds on the specifics of these devices. But terrific interview with Dr. George. The passion is clearly there. And as you mentioned, Justin, having someone that has seen both sides of the equation and believes in educating both sides of that, I mean, that's just a tremendous powerhouse for good.
Yeah, we need to get more people on board with that movement for sure, Hank. All right, that's going to do it for this show. But I got to tell you, the best way to listen to our podcast is to download the smartphone app for iPhone and Android, and make sure that you check for bonus content on the app. Many episodes have it, and it's available just by opening up the episode, clicking on the gift box. But if you're already listening to a number of other podcasts on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, I get it. You're going to keep it in one place. We're available everywhere. Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, whatever your favorite podcast application is, you're going to find Beyond Clean there. And I do want to say that while you're there, make sure you give us a rating and a review. Your feedback is important to Hank and myself and the rest of us here at Beyond Clean. And as far as feedback goes, the best way to reach us is to send an email to info@beyondclean.net. We want to hear from you. We want your ideas around topics or guests that you think would be really great for us to have on the show. If you have a theme for a different season or another, that would also be great. And also, if there's something that you heard on one of these episodes and you want to just give a shout out to a prior guest or a topic or something that really made a difference in your day-to-day, we definitely want to hear about it. Again, that email, info@beyondclean.net. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.